Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Keido Vigil, or Vigil, depending on where you're at. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I live here with Echo. And today I'm going to talk about Master Tozan, Tozan Ryokai. But first, I'd like to thank our teachers, Shinko Roshi and Shishin Roshi, for allowing me and everyone else to give a talk, to the Sangha on these various teachers. So Tozan Ryokai is his Japanese name, but he was a Chinese master who lived at the end of the Tang Dynasty. And this talk is I'm seeing it as, in a way, a continuation of Myozan's talk last week on Master Rinzai. He was the founder of the Rinzai tradition. Tozan Ryokai is the founder of the Kadong school of Zen, which I'll talk about a little bit later, ended up becoming Soto Zen. And the reason why I see it as a continuation is because we're in the White Plum tradition, and Shishin Roshi's teacher, Meizumi Roshi, founded the White Plum tradition here in the United States after coming from Japan. And I'm sorry if I'm repeating things you already know. Some of you, I'm assuming, don't know this. And he received Dharma transmission from Rinzai teachers and Soto teacher. I think it's the Soto teacher that he received transmission from was, I know its father, and maybe there was another one. I don't want to speak out of school. Talk's not about Meizumi Roshi, but the fact that our practice, this tradition, the White Plum tradition, coming through both Shinko Roshi and Shishin Roshi, is a blend of Rinzai and Soto Zen. So continuation talk. So Tozan is his Japanese name, and he has a couple other Chinese names depending on the transliteration system, I guess, that you use. His name is Tongshan under the Wade Giles system, which was a system for Romanizing Chinese characters that was developed in the 1860s by British scholars. And, by Romanizing, if you don't know, I mean transliterating Chinese characters into Roman letters and Arabic numbers. Under the Pinyin system, which was developed in the 1950s by Chinese scholars who lived in the People's Republic of China, his name is Dongshan Liangji. I think that's how you pronounce it. In Pinyin, I know that Pinyin allows for a closer pronunciation to Mandarin Chinese than the Wade Giles system does, and certainly than the Japanese system does. Because I took, when I was going to college, I actually took some courses on Chinese history and learned a little bit about this. But I think it's important to understand that as you're looking this guy up. In my own research of putting together this talk, I learned both the names so I could find him, when I was doing research, because sometimes he's under Tozan Ryokai, sometimes he's under Tongshan, sometimes he's under Dongshan Lianji. And to further complicate things, which I won't get into, he also has a Korean name and a Vietnamese name as well. But I'll just call him Tozan because most of my Zen practice and training has been in the White Plum tradition, and that's how I've always heard about it. But it's good to know all three. Let me give you one further complication. that this is Tozan Ryokai. This is not Tozan Chuso. Tozan Chuso is the guy that pops up in the Mumonkan. So he's often confused based on what I've read with Tozan Ryokai. But no, this is Tozan Ryokai, not Tozan Chuso. He was born in 807 at the very end of the Tang Dynasty, which, let me see, I'm to find my place here, which in a city called Shaoxing, which is on the Guangzhou Bay on the central east coast of modern China. And Shaoxing, which you might know because of the famous rice wine that it produces. If you've ever cooked Chinese food, tried to cook authentic Chinese food, then you probably know that the flavor of Chinese food is largely Shaoxing rice wine. And Shaoxing is a pretty big city, 21 million people now. And he was born at the very end of the Tang Dynasty, which is considered by most scholars to be, the pinnacle of ancient Chinese culture. But he was born at the very end of the Tang Dynasty. So he lived through a period of disintegration and social upheaval, which I talked a little bit about when I talked about Tozan back in December. But I think it's helpful to understand the world he lived in because I think in getting to know him, it humanizes him, and it's helpful, at least for me, to be able to penetrate and become intimate with some of his teachings. And like I said in my talk in December, his life wasn't too unlike ours. And he's someone that I feel like we can sort of recognize, and taking a look at the world he lived in is a good first step in approaching him and maybe even approaching the koans that he pops up in that we encounter in our study. So again, during his whole life, China was in a state of constant political upheaval. And it was a world in which wealthy families fought for power, and there was a series of assassinations and coups, and the China as a coherent, I don't know if the word nation is correct when you're going back, but as a coherent culture that was under a system of governance was falling apart, and slavery and serfdom were common. But the wealthy families, and this should ring a bell for some of us, the wealthy families who fought for power didn't pay taxes and they didn't work. They had a sophisticated examination system that filled a huge bureaucracy with a class of literate bureaucrats that was pulled from elite families, not too unlike the system that we have here in the United States, with Ivy League schools and which the courts and very often, not always, but often bureaucratic institutions and even the legislative institutions pull elite elite sons and daughters to serve in the government. They had official currency of coins that they shared across China. And they had a vast system of canals for transporting goods across the empire and a whole series of dams and irrigation ditches that wasn't too unlike what we have here in the American West. And during Tozan's life, one of the issues that was recurring was ecological disaster that was rooted in deforestation of the mountains. You might have heard this term that it was a world lit only by fire. So fire was the only source of artificial light. It was largely the only source of heat. And so the mountains were deforested, which caused massive erosion, which would fill the rivers and reservoirs up with silt and cause devastating flooding. also an ecological instability that was reflected in how the China at that time, the Tzu, so Chinese elite groups were officially Taoist. The government was run on Confucian lines, but they were religiously tolerant. And I thought it was interesting to find out that Nestorian Christianity, Islam, Manichaeism, as well as Buddhism were pretty well known. So Tozan, probably was familiar with Islam. He was probably familiar with Christianity. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider because oftentimes when we encounter these teachers and koans, they sort of come to us out of the mist of the past as these sort of unknowing sages, who have very little cultural context to place them in. There was some persecution at that time, but it wasn't persecution of Buddhism as a religion. It was really more about trying to rein in monasteries so they could control monasteries, control taxation, and control the politics that were taught in Buddhist monasteries. And again, this might ring a bell for some of us here thinking about American politics. One of the issues that the Tang emperors were fighting against, at least in their mind, was, on the one hand, you had the idea that had taken root in some Buddhist schools of the three periods of the Dharma, and that China was, looking at everything around them, China was in the period of decline. The Dharma was in decline. So since the Dharma was in decline, China was in decline, there was no legitimate authority. You didn't have to obey the emperor. On the other end of it was the cult of Maitreya, and the cult of Maitreya was an apocalyptic Buddhist cult that sort of felt like, well, the second coming of the Buddha is going to come, and we're not going to, sort of get too involved in anything. So there's apocalyptic cults on the one hand, and then, sort of anarchistic cults on the other hand. So in trying to think about what was going on in terms of the late Tang period, the suppression of Buddhism was really more political and less ideological. And Ryozan had pointed out in her last talk last week that Thich Nhat Hanh had sort of opined that Zen probably wasn't as affected, and that's probably true. So that's enough of that. I think you get the picture of the world Tozan lived in, a little bit more sophisticated than I would have thought, and certainly more complicated and a little bit more tragic. Tozan himself was from an educated family, and he started his Zen studies, if you could believe it, at the age of 10, and he was fully ordained as a monk by the time he was 21. There's not a lot that's known about his early life as a monk, other than he spent a lot of years traveling from monastery to monastery. He received Dharma transmission from Ungo Dojo after encountering many teachers, including Isan. And Isan had sent him to Ungo Donjo, and the story of his first awakening is case 39 in the Denkuroku, or the transmission of the lamp, and here it is. Isan sent Tozan to Ungo Donjo, whom he asked, "Who can hear the non-sentient preach the Dharma?" Ungo answered, "The non-sentient can hear the non-sentient preach the Dharma." Tozan asked, "Can you hear it?" Ungo replied, "If I could hear it, you would not be able to hear me preach the Dharma." Tozan replied, "In that case, I do not hear you preach the Dharma." Ungo said, "If you still don't hear me preach the Dharma, how much less can you hear the non-sentient preach the Dharma?" At this, Tozan had an insight. Inanimate phenomena teach the Dharma of inanimate phenomena. Sentient beings teach the Dharma of sentient beings. The Dharma is not restricted to words and phrases, or even to sounds. It is also physiological and topological. Then Tozan said in a verse, "Wonderful, wonderful. The preaching of the Dharma by the non-sentient is inconceivable. If you try to hear with your ears, it's hard to understand. When you listen with your mind's eye, then you know it." Again, going back to Myozan again, she spoke about this a little bit when she was talking about paying attention to our body, paying attention to feelings of being stuck, feelings of being having your energy sort of blocked. And it seems to me, and I know this, I want to be mindful this isn't a Dharma talk, Tozan's sort of hinting at that. The non-sentient beings teach non-sentient beings. Sentient beings teach sentient beings. Tozan doesn't appear in the Gateless Barrier, and he's in only one koan in the Blue Cliff record. He appears in a few of the koans in the Book of Equanimity, and of course he appears in the Transmission of the Lamp. He wrote the 5 ranks, which Shishin Roshi gave a series of talks on and is actually writing a book on right now. And he's also given credit for composing the Song of the Precious Mirror Samadhi, which some scholars say he didn't compose it, but there was a later composition that was attributed to him. We'll just forget I said that, and we can continue to attribute it to him. But since this is a little bit of a scholarly talk, I thought I'd let you know. But maybe, or arguably most important for this Sangha, is that at the age of 52, Tozan founded a monastery and essentially, in effect, started with what's called the Kadong School of Zen, which emphasized Zazen and what you might call gradual awakening. And a few hundred years later, Dogen would go to China from Japan, study Kadong, bring it back to Japan, and help establish Soto Zen in the 13th century. And that lineage of Soto Zen, of course, was transmitted down to Maezumi Roshi and then down to both of our teachers in this Sangha. And Maezumi Roshi studied, of course, as I said before, both Soto and Rinzai. So while we don't know much about Tozan himself, we can sort of think about the world he lived in, what we've learned in our lineage, and the treasures that he's left behind. So going back to case 43 of the Blue Cliff record, a monk asked Tozan, when cold and heat come, how does one avoid them? Tozan answered, why not go where there's no cold and heat? The monk replied, how is it where there's no cold and heat? Tozan replied, when it's cold, it kills you with cold. When it's hot, it kills you with heat. So here we see, this is sort of a typical dialogue with Tozan. A monk approaches him who seems to have some insight, some curiosity, and some courage, to engage Tozan for whatever his reasons are. And Tozan pulls the ground out from under him, or maybe pulls out anything that the monk's mind can stick to. And this seems typical for Tozan. In case 94, the Book of Equanimity, which I talked about in December, my Shuso Hosen talk, Tozan encounters another monk. Attention, Tozan was ill. A monk asked, Osho, you're sick. Is there someone who is not sick? And Tozan answered, yes, there is. The monk asked, does the one who is not sick look after you? And Tozan replied, this old monk is able to look after others. The monk asked, Osho, how about when you look after others? And Tozan said, when helping others, sickness is not seen. So again, we see a monk who's engaging Tozan, trying to nail him down to something that his mind can grasp onto. But instead, Tozan pushes the monk back to practice, seems to be giving the monk the message, stop trying to figure things out. Stop trying to nail me down. Just practice, and figuring out will take care of itself as a matter of course. So to me, it goes back to his original verse, memorializing his first awakening that I read from the Transmission of the Lamp of the Den-Koroku. The preaching of the Dharma by the non-sentient is inconceivable. If you try to hear it with your ears, it's hard to understand. When you listen with your mind's eye, then you know it. And this to me has the flavor of Soto Zen, at least as I've experienced, and the practice of Zazen. Like in the song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi, even if Tozan didn't really compose it, it says, mastered or not, reality constantly flows. Practice intimately working within as though a fool, like an idiot. So sort of looking at all these things, maybe venturing a little bit to synthesize it, seems like Tozan, there's a theme of Tozan encouraging us to just be new, to not be an expert, which is very much a theme of Soto Zen, contemporary Soto Zen, particularly the kind of Soto Zen that's come here in the United States. And to try to be aware when our mind begins to stick on something, when it ossifies. And you see this sort of teaching in Suzuki Roshi's phrase, beginner's mind, which at this point is really so well known that it's become, almost like an Americanism. And you can speak to people that know nothing about Zen, talk a little bit about beginner's mind, and people will well, oops, I almost said something I shouldn't say. Certain people, let's just say that. Certain people will, understand. And I like to read stuff about music theory, music practice, particularly music, the development of musical technique. And Soto Zen teachings have definitely bled into music pedagogy in the Western world. Just really briefly, there is a very well-known book called Effortless Mastery, which is very much influenced by Buddhism. And it's basically a book that says, more or less, if you disappear and stop thinking, that you'll be a really good violin player or something like that, some guitar player, whatever it is. At any rate, and we see this with Meizumi Roshi's phrase, appreciate your life. And this kind of resonates with me this week, because after 3 years, almost 3 years, actually on my birthday of March in 2020, I don't want to tell you what my birth date is because I don't want you all to send me presents. But on my birthday in 2020, I was sent home for telework for 2 weeks because of the pandemic. And, I went back and totally rearranged my life. My life is, done. We've done session and, everything has been rearranged in my life, logistically, psychologically, economically, so on and so forth. Well, on Thursday, I had to go back to work in my office for the first time in 3 years. And I did not like it. I'm actually angry, disappointed, petulant, maybe like a little kid throwing a fit. Literally, I don't want to go back to work. That's kind of how I feel. I was off for 3 years. It's not fair. I'm experiencing a lot of that. But, reality constantly flows. And these teachings of Tozan literally are very useful to me because I have to get up, put on my dumb clothes and go to my dumb office and do my dumb job, and it doesn't matter how I feel about it. That's what's required if I want to maintain my life, and I have to make my peace with that. I guess I can quit my job, and but that's not realistic for me. So these are very useful teachings to practice this sort of fresh mind. And I feel pretty confident that that Tozan fully experienced and appreciated the back and forth between fresh mind and stuck mind and ossified mind, and that he himself had to struggle uh, and go through this practice that we all sort of engage in, this difficult practice of trying to continuously see where we're stuck and continuously try to see where we can let go, how we can let go in ways big and small. So these teachings are, very useful to me this week. It doesn't mean I'm not grumbling about it. Doesn't mean I'm not disappointed. But it does mean that I have a set of workable, useful tools, Zazen, and even, just kind of intellectually remembering this stuff and remembering to appreciate my life, remembering to have a beginner's mind, remembering that reality constantly flows. And to just be an idiot, to just be like the dummy that has to go to work and just do it. When Tozan was about to die, and he died when he was 62, he shaved his head and composed a poem, and then sat in Zazen where he died or appeared to die. And he was sitting up, in Zazen, dead, like sort of, like these sort of mummies, the mummies of saints or whatever. And he was sitting there, and the congregation of monks and whoever else was there started wailing and gnashing their teeth and crying. And, it turned into a big, sorrowful scene. And Tozan opened his eyes and started bawling them all out because they wouldn't give him any peace because he was dead. You're not giving an old man any peace. I want to die here in peace, and you're making noise. So he got up and he ordered the cook of the monastery to prepare what he called a stupidity meal, which he, served to the monks. And then he lived for another 7 days and then died. So even in the process of his death, his message to his monks was not to get stuck, because mastered or not, reality constantly flows. Practicing intimately, working within, as though a fool, like an idiot. Thank you for listening.